Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak. I'm looking forward to a conversation, so I put together a few slides that I'd like to just trot through to give you a bit of a rambling tour around philanthropy and science and Imperial as well. But I do really want to open this up and make sure we have time for a conversation and a chat. So I have a few slides, and I want to debunk a few myths about philanthropy, that it's only an American enterprise. First of all, although we'll speak about that you have to be rich and a billionaire to be a philanthropist, and that it's on its own, it can change the world. It's part of an important ecosystem for supporting science, but many other human enterprises. So I've got a few slides, and I've had little technical difficulties at the front end. So Bill has kindly offered to sort of drive through the slides as I talk. So welcome. I'm Michael Murphy, Vice President for Advancement at Imperial. I joined the college 2 years ago, and it's an absolute delight to be with Imperial and one of the best universities in the world. Real delight. So as David has mentioned, I've done a lot of work with scientific organizations and have been involved in philanthropy through much of my career. So I have some thoughts and observations on it I'd like to share. Next slide, please, Bill. Thank you. Philanthropy is an old and deeply human part of humanity. Its origins we see in Western literature goes back to Aeschylus and the play Prometheus Bound, when Prometheus so affronted Zeus by offering fire and knowledge to puny mortals and humans. Of course, he incurred the wrath of Zeus, and it was an insult that philanthropy was a term of love of humankind, which Zeus hurled as an insult. Of course, the implications for Prometheus was pretty dire, to have his liver chewed out throughout eternity. So it had a controversial start, but it's had a long history. In Athens and Greek life, philanthropy was considered part of life in Greek life, that elites were encouraged to support public activities through private support and culture. It was part of democratic culture going far back. But it's not only in Greece and not only in the ancient world in Greece, across humanity. Ancient cultures and contemporary cultures have seen philanthropy, that is the giving to other human beings and giving to human activity from your own private resources and your own private motivations, as deeply meaningful. Next slide, please. For Imperial, philanthropy and private support for a public mission comes back to our founding. So of course, Prince Albert, our great founder of Exhibition Road, and not only laying the groundwork for Imperial College itself, but many of the great institutions in our neighborhood, in the district around us, the Natural History Museum, Science Museum, the V&A Museum, and others, founded the Great Exhibition by public subscription. And there's a chart here that shows the average subscription per capita and the number of subscribers in different parts of the country. And it's remarkable to think, that when this fantastic exhibition was created in 1851 in Bolton, for example, nearly 1,000 donors had given an average of 12 shillings. Quite a lot of money at that time, but it was actually a really important public activity. The funds that was created by the Great Exhibition has laid the foundation for not only Imperial, but many other important future institutions from the day. Next slide, please. Science has a long history and tradition of philanthropy playing an important role. I've spent some time with the Royal Society, and so know many of the stories there. One of my favorite fellows of the Royal Society is actually Benjamin Franklin, who was treasurer of the Royal Society at one point. He was a recipient of the Copley Medal, which is the oldest scientific prize in existence. He also, when he returned back to North America and created, as I think, a real font of innovation around how to mobilize public support, private support for public activities, founding universities, hospitals, fire departments, many ways involving public subscription in the process. Galileo, pictured here, was sponsored by the Medici family. And imagine Galileo's life and his thinking if he were fully constrained only by support from the church. So there's an important independence and risk-taking that philanthropy and private support can bring to science itself. Next slide, please. Just some pioneers. These are some just people that I think are really fascinating and important throughout different cultures and times. not just in a scientific realm, but Mary Elizabeth Garrett helped found the Johns Hopkins Medical School with a requirement that women were enrolled. Of course, Alfred Nobel, a European, established the Nobel Prize, which has driven a major direction of how philanthropy can impact science, along with the Copley Medal. Mary McLeod Bethune established a school for African-American girls in Florida through private support, and Gandhi used traditional concepts of giving and recasting them in terms of philanthropy. Next slide, please, Bill. So just a sense of this is some information of kind of over the last century, the biggest top philanthropists of the century from Abdul-Gif Haroon, and you'll see they come from all across different countries and times. The Tata founder of the Tata family fortune is not well known is according to this the largest philanthropy in the century. But we see the likes of Henry Wellcome, who was born in Wisconsin in the United States, of course, moved to London and would create and found what we know now as the Wellcome Trust, one of the world's largest medical charities. Bill and Melinda Gates, Howard Hughes, Warren Buffett, George Soros, all well known. But there's a sense that the great people can create great things, but that's more than just these great people and their vast wealth at play. Next slide, please. I thought this was an interesting way to look at a bit of the kind of evolution and more recent trajectory tracking philanthropy and science, innovation and development. This is a very American focus. This is from an article by Bob Kahn, who was a founder of a group called the Science Philanthropy Alliance, which I encourage you, if you're interested to learn more about this, to engage with this group. Of course, this is an American view of 4 epochs of economic development in the US, moving from agriculture to the current digital information age, and how philanthropy has moved to drive science and innovation through those periods. And the 2 periods, these epochs of the industrial age and this digital information age, are really in what we would consider the Gilded Age. And much of what we consider modern philanthropy has been set by that initially Gilded Age of the industrial age, with Andrew Carnegie and his famous or infamous Gospel of Wealth, which is really required reading to get a sense of what's laid the foundation of it. You could argue that today we are in an even higher Gilded Age if you look at the concentration of wealth and the new ways in which wealth is being brought in to support science. And there's an interplay between public support and private support, which is essential. And I want to touch on this, that we must have a balance of public support and private support, and private support in different forms to have a healthy ecosystem for innovation in science. And the Vannevar-Bush report in 1945 really turbocharged in America public investment in science. And there was a bit of a drop off in philanthropy at that time, and it's now coming back in importance. And of course, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, their founders' pledge, giving pledge, has been really important for today's philanthropy. Next slide, please. Just a little bit on models of how philanthropy, mobilizing private support can advance the enterprise overall of science. There's institution building, like supporting the establishment of great universities, laboratories, observatories, academies, museums. There's fundamental and applied questions, targeted driven grant making and support for answering really big challenging questions. An example might be the mobilization around the Human Genome Project. Grand Challenges support and funding through the Gates Foundation really uses this model, and the Wellcome Trust also is very much focused around research questions and looking at answering these big, deep questions, important questions that have impact. Then another model is this prize model. Now, Alfred Nobel and Copley had established this of celebrating the great achievements of scientists. I think there's limitations to what can be achieved with that. Oftentimes, those who receive these prizes, it has more of an impact of the public engagement and public understanding with science than it does moving the enterprise forward. And sometimes I feel there's too much of a focus on prizes for those who've achieved a great accomplishment, rather than brilliant people, which is a very important focus for philanthropy, to drive forward the brilliant, smart people who get research fellowships to have the independence from the teaching they may have, other administrative duties, and the freedom of thought to explore deep questions and how they translate into human solution. So kind of 4 models in which people have approached bringing their philanthropy to supporting science itself. Overall, it's essential there's a balance between government funding. There must be public research funding, and you'll see in different countries a different balance, a higher public investment as a proportion to the private support. But private philanthropy is absolutely important to give that sort of risk capital so that you don't get caught up in what can be overly conservative, sometimes public funding, or funding of research that's driven by the demands of the decision makers of the day. And then investment that comes in the form of corporate involvement and research, R&D, and innovation to new startups. In America, for example, 44% of basic research in US at private institutions is funded by philanthropy. Next slide, please. I want to just mention a little about philanthropy as risk capital, because there's an impact that it has, not just in moving money in to do this important work, but the way in which it frees people up. The pap smear wouldn't have happened, you could argue, without the risk that the Commonwealth Fund took on its founder, Papadopoulos, who at the time it was considered a wild idea outside of the mainstream, and now it's made a big difference. Norman Borlaug in the Green Revolution, the Rockefeller Foundation had a fundamental impact in driving that forward. The first automated DNA sequencer, Lee Hood, would have had a real challenge to build this if he didn't have the support of Saul Price, who founded a chain of grocery stores and stores. At Imperial, just recently, as we've gone through the COVID pandemic response, millions of pounds have been contributed to the work at Imperial. That gave us the freedom to move quickly, and also the freedom for our colleagues to make an impact without going through a very slow, cautious process of applying for public funding at the same time. Next slide, please. So at Imperial, just to share with you, and these are real heroes for the college and important for our university and the work that we do. Sir Michael Uren has helped support the new bioengineering hub at White City, which has been opened and will celebrate its opening in the coming months, and is now filling in with great bioengineers doing work. Art Moan and Community Jamil have made major commitments and support to our School of Public Health and work we do around child health and well-being, and the important work we do around epidemiology and emergency disease response. And families like the Wilson Foundation, the Garfield Weston Foundation have made a major impact on universities and science across the UK, as they have at Imperial, and Sir James Dyson and Alan Howard, of course, have made big donations to make a big impact in business and design engineering. Next slide, please. So that's just sort of some of a quick tour of some of the history of science, some of the models of science, some of the people who have made a big difference at Imperial, even in our founding. Here's some further reading that I'd recommend to you. Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. There's an excellent article, The Power of Science Philanthropy, here. There's a very good book called Winners Take All, which takes a critical view of the role of philanthropy over dominating the domain in civil society, and of course the Science Philanthropy Alliance and Bob Kahn's article, which I drew that from. So I want to thank my colleague Pramod Puthanapalli, who helped me put together some of these slides, and I'd like to just end it there and hand it over to you, David, for conversation. Sorry, David, you're on mute right now.
Yeah, I know. It's I think they've modified my form of Teams, or the way I was watching it, because the mute button wasn't where I was expecting, or the unmute button in this case. Michael, that was a fascinating run through a few, millennia of philanthropy and science, and certainly one is very aware of the significance. But it seems to me some countries seem to do it better than others. Do you have a sense of why that is? I mean, really, in the US, to be perfectly frank, you've had an awful lot of examples of scientific philanthropy, while at the same time getting large amounts of investment from the government. In other countries, it tends to be one way or the other. And I just wondered if you understood whether that was cultural or...
Yeah, I think it's part of it's cultural, part of it's the way in which the countries have approached the way they resource the science and innovation enterprise overall. So in countries where they have very major investments in public funding for science, then philanthropy plays a more attenuated role, because many people will say, well, my tax my tax funds are going towards that work, and it's not something that I would consider. And then institutions aren't geared to engaging with donors, great, very large donors, and also people who make more modest donations too. So there's a part of giving and asking that's developed over time as culture, but it's not something that's some countries are better at it because they've had more time and developed more traditions of giving. And you see that in the history of those countries. So in the United States, for example, there's been a long history of giving to churches and religious organizations. You see that as a deep part of philanthropy, and science has kind of come part of that tradition. There's also been a skepticism of public support up until the Bush-Vanderveer report and the major investments in science. But I like to remind people that major philanthropy as we know it today really was almost a Victorian invention that was brought to America by the likes of Andrew Carnegie, who was born in Scotland and came to America. And the Americans really took it and ran with it. And Victorians really had, if you look at what Prince Albert was able to accomplish in 1851, and we followed a similar trajectory, Britain would, while we are ahead of many other countries, we're not a world leader in philanthropy. Other countries like Australia have really stepped much more quickly forward. So I think there's a dynamic interplay between public funding and private funding, and sometimes the public funding, if it overwhelms the private funding, there's a disincentive.
Yeah, but there is also a difference. Actually, Carnegie, I'm particularly fond of because certainly I come from a fairly deprived background, and the Carnegie libraries in my hometown in England was for me a major opening culturally. Yeah, there were all these books, and it was free for me to do. But yeah, I think there is very much an attitude of mind. But I think you picked up something very important about philanthropic gifting to science, and that is risk. Mm-hmm. There is this terrible thing, the person called the taxpayer, that is the bane of anyone who wants to get money out of public sources. You have clearly to police this, the way the money is distributed, and there is an aversion to risk. And yet, I think it's true that risk is often at the root of the most major discoveries in science. The really big game changers are the things people not everybody understood, just a few people understood. And that seems to me to be an important element in philanthropic giving, in the sense that it's true, you have to pay attention to what the philanthropist might do, might want, their name on a building or whatever. But on the other hand, you don't have to answer whole time to making it zero risk, so that you know before you do the research what the answer is. Exactly. I don't know, do you feel this tension? I mean, for me, on a personal level, but I mean, that's an anecdotal from my side.
It's a
what do you have to say about that?
It's a powerful driver of the value of philanthropy, because if it were much of a muchness, if I can say that, it doesn't matter how the money comes in, there would still be the same flexibility for a dynamic scientific enterprise, where you can look at some of the deep fundamental questions, not know where it's going to actually translate into human use, and then eventually it will translate into some important application or not. We just understand nature in a better way. And you have things like, there's something called the Golden Fleece Award, I think it's called, the US, which is entirely unhelpful, that nitpicks through grants that the National Science Foundation or other public funding bodies might make, and sort of makes fun of how silly that would be. When you think of the World Wide Web itself was developed from the work of Tim Berners-Lee, many others, who was working at CERN, and he wasn't trying to figure out how to make the World Wide Web at the time. So, and the Pap smear is a good example of where research funding can be overly conservative, even by those who just make the decisions in the scientific community who are on those panels sometimes, because you want to know that you have the results are in sight. And so philanthropy allows that risk so that you actually have better science is conducted as a result. If it's all funded by private funding, first of all, there's not enough to do that. There's risks on the other end that it's driven by private interests only. And so you have, some important questions aren't being answered because philanthropists or a group of human beings don't have an interest as much as they do around a species of tree as compared to a certain very serious health disease.
Yeah, I think that's clearly part of the story. I think, and what I thought you brought out very nicely was exactly the difference between institutional funding, governmental funding, and what the quality of what philanthropists brought. I was kind of interested in some of your history because you mentioned Galileo. Galileo was rather a curious. He certainly had philanthropy from the Medici,
Yep.
who were the rulers of the part of Florence, where his hometown, so his home area. But actually, of course, he did take government money, but in those days you had to go to Venice to really get money out of the government. So he managed to play both sides of the street. I thought he made an interesting example because you also brought in the church. And let's say Galileo's career didn't get greatly helped by the church. I don't know. Are there other stories associated with the way money has come, which can end up with the researcher getting into trouble because they've chosen the wrong route?
I'll share another story, which again, this goes back to Benjamin Franklin, who's one of my favorite fellows of the Royal Society. But of course, he wasn't popular with the leadership of Britain after the Revolution, and
probably surprising.
But the Royal Society and many other great scientific academies, like the National Academy of Sciences and others, are independent from government for good reason. And that allows them to make decisions and recommendations based on the best science at the time, not on the will of the leader of the country at that point. And you could see that playing out as important as science plays a bigger role in policy decisions we make around our health and our future safety and sustainability and living on this planet. But Franklin developed, among his technologies is the lightning rod system that will control lightning strikes. And the British Navy was having a real hard time of depots blowing up from lightning strikes, and they were looking for the best technology to solve this. So very clear, not political question, had nothing to do with American independence or remaining in the empire. And they looked at it, the panel at the time at the Royal Society, they recommended Franklin's technology, and George III at the time has said, absolutely not, we cannot allow that. We can't have, rebel technology placed on protecting our Navy. And I believe that there's a kind of a famous letter that in the archives of the Royal Society where the president at the time, I can't recall, there's a wrote to the king and said, well, I'm sorry, but you cannot dictate nature to us. And so that's an example I like to draw upon on how important it is to have that independence. That research, Franklin developed that regardless out of his own interest, but the application and the kind of science policy elements of independence is really important. You see that every day around the world now.
That's a wonderful story. I mean, I hope you don't mind plagiarism, but I think I
Not at all.
Myself.
The Royal Society has a much more accurate record.
Well,
of
I
that.
may check out the detail, but very interesting story. Let's go back to this risk thing, because our government in Britain is trying to produce with public money some of the blue skies aspect, where you can do what you like, with this new research agency we're having called ARIA. What's your take on that? I mean, I would hate to have the Vannevar Bush effect where public philanthropy is discouraged.
Yeah,
because
that's a very good question. I don't think the Vannevar Bush effect was because there was such a major investment in the United States in the core of science research through the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation. So there was a dramatic shift in the investment post-war. Space race had a lot to do with it, of course, to keep up with the Soviets. But ARIA's the scale and scope of money going into ARIA is not going to. I don't think it's going to make an impact in terms of the size of it. Isn't going to diminish the importance of philanthropy because it isn't such a gigantic amount, and it's probably just. I don't know the details of it. Likely moving more money around in the science budget than it is adding to it. So that's based on the DARPA model and the EARPA model in the U.S. and there's some advantages to that flexibility. But I'm not concerned about it discouraging philanthropy.
Okay.
I hope it works, but it's. I'm not an expert in that.
It seems to me to have some of the advantages that philanthropic setups have of turning researchers loose.
Yep.
On research. I mean, you made a point that actually I realized I agreed with without knowing beforehand, and that is people are more important than prizes.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, turning researchers loose to do the work that might win them a prize is probably better. I mean, how do you deal with that when you're talking to potential philanthropists?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, people give the motivation to give, and we I think many people ourselves support charities and organizations ourselves. We think of what's important to us. What do we want to achieve? What feels good? It's important that the decisions of philanthropists and donors is really important in being centered to what's important to them. Are there things they're excited about understanding the universe, and they really want to understand. They want to support science in deep space research because they're just so fascinated by it. Other people, they really care about the Anthropocene and survival of the human species in this critical time and addressing climate change and sustainability. So you have to, keep in mind people's motivations as well. And I think that the prize model of celebrating the great achievements, oftentimes it's seen as a way to incentivize and stimulate science. But those people who generally, by the time you've figured out something as complicated as CRISPR-Cas9, for example, you've already won many accolades. So it's more engaging the public, and I think it becomes a crowded space. So working with people to think, what do you really want to achieve? What are the things you really care about? If it's prizes, think about if that's either prizes for an achievement, then how to support work in that question, or people who are leading to that work so that they can win the Nobel Prize or the Lasker or the Cosmo Prize. There is an interesting model innovated that came out of the UK called the Longitude Prize, which was started by government parliamentary funding, which I believe the Royal Society was the adjudicator in this process to figure out the longitude problem. And that led to Harrison's clocks and using time measurement in order to locate longitude accurately. But it was a prize to whoever could figure out this challenge. So put the challenge out there, and whoever could figure it out would receive £1 million or what have you. And that has created a new model of what's called inducement prizes, which is another approach that some philanthropists are taking. There's a new longitude prize looking at antimicrobial resistance. There's a group called the X Prize, which has done things like space shots and trying to create tricorders from Star Trek and so forth. So that's another approach, is to put a challenge out there and incentivize the innovation and the science that goes into it. There's challenges with that as well. So I guess I just step back and ask people, what do you really want to achieve? What's really important to you? My own view, and I'm biased on this, institution building and building people is the most important investment people can make in science and the big questions. So the likes of Howard Hughes, who was an eccentric person to be sure, and probably in his life didn't think that much about science, but his Howard Hughes HHMI Medical Institution fellowships, those people who've gone through and been funded by that have made tremendous differences in so many different fields. And it's all focused on supporting the best and brightest to let them loose to go do their work.
Yeah, well, Howard Hughes did make some aeronautical scientific
He did.
advances. In fact, Hughes aircraft was really quite influential in the stages of American aeronautics, aviation,
Absolutely.
and so on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but he was certainly eccentric.
Eccentric, but it's interesting. He chose to what the Howard Hughes Medical Institute is really funding brilliant individuals for a long time. It hasn't been. He didn't choose to set up an aeronautics only research area.
Okay, I feel that there may be people who want to raise a hand. On my screen, there's a raise hand facility somewhere down at the bottom that you click on. It says reactions, and when I click on that, I find one of the reactions I can have is to raise a hand. So would anyone else like to join in the discussion and cross-examine Michael, and or perhaps contribute your own thoughts on this issue of scientific philanthropy, which frankly is extraordinarily important to an institution like Imperial?
So I've allowed people to unmute, so I can see Yana and John have got raised hands. So
okay,
shall we?
Yana, do you want to speak?
You should be able to unmute. Okay, let me unmute
able to unmute.
Oh, thanks. I got my gift of speech back again. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was kind of wondering, we all associate America with kind of where the philanthropy is embedded in the ways of behaviors and differently from here. So I would be interested to hear your comparison between those two countries. I'm making an assumption that you are very familiar with the USA scene.
Sure, thank you. So a comparison of the US and the UK or Europe in general?
Please.
Okay. So I think of course, the two countries have such a long interaction culturally, economically, and scientifically. They're very deep ties together. That I think the role of philanthropy in science has been cross-seeded between the two countries. And so you see I'll go back to Henry Wellcome, for example, who was from America and came to London when he finally established the Wellcome Trust with his great wealth. That's one of the top health and medical foundations in the world. And there's groups as well, sort of thinking beyond science, of public bodies which are loved and supported by the public, like the National Trust, for example, which is an enormous membership group by private subscription to create the National Trust separate from government, which America could really use something like that as a model to go back and forth. You'll see, I think, the larger scale of philanthropy in the United States, I think, is part of culture. It's also part of the traditions that have been built at universities primarily, but also traditions that have been built in churches, and the religious support is very high in America relative to Britain. So universities has for decades been building a tradition of philanthropy among their alumni to their university, and developing the kind of expertise and interaction externally to reach out to support from philanthropists. In the UK, it's still fairly new for universities to be doing that relative to our peers. And so there's tradition building as part of it. And there's a bit of it is the legal framework and the tax framework. But culturally, it's important that people are celebrated for their giving. They want to feel good about what they've done. And if they're in a culture where they feel ashamed by their support, then that minimizes the tradition that could be built. I think there are some countries, some cultures which are still suspicious, particularly of very significant philanthropic support from elites in their country that reflects the suspicion that's there. So they either are quiet about it, or they just, there's a barrier to overcome. Whereas in America, it's much more celebrated. Here, it's becoming much more celebrated as well. And also other countries like Australia is one of the largest top philanthropic countries per GDP outside of the US and Canada. in Asia, philanthropy is a really important part of the traditions there, and Hong Kong, Singapore, and Europe as well. There it is growing.
Thank you. Very interesting points. I hadn't thought about kind of wealth shaming that you brought forward, and also the aspect of which is almost like a crowdfunding.
Yes.
Kind of bringing that into the scientific arena. A lot of creative aspects. Entrepreneurs use that already. So maybe the science to be done that way as well.
Very much so.
Thank you.
Cancer Research UK, which supports a lot of very important research at Imperial and elsewhere, is primarily funded by many average citizens.
Right, John, can you unmute yourself?
Yep, okay, that works. No, I was just thinking about the other end, the average citizen. Of course, the average citizen hasn't got £1 million to donate, but they are quite willing to actually sit there and donate their time in things like citizen science projects. You look at just how much goes on at things like Galaxy Zoo and all these various projects. And they, of course, I think, I don't know what they're really motivated by being one of them. Is it the sort of sense of discovery? It's presumably not getting sort of worldwide recognition. I don't know. I just wonder what your opinions were on that end of things.
Yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, John, I'm so glad you raised that, because citizen science, I didn't put a section about that because it's, again, mobilizing people for the scientific enterprise. Money is one way to do it. So people with money support small ways or large ways to those who are doing the work. Or yourself, that if you yourself are just fascinated by the universe and you want to be involved in your own little way as you can without having gone through all of the efforts to become a fully trained scientist, there are ways you can get involved as a citizen in exploration of the universe and finding new bodies. And there's a story, I can't remember when, it was not too long ago, there was, I think, a high school student, a secondary student, who through a citizen science platform found a new stellar entity.
I think you're thinking about Hanny's Vorwerk.
Yeah, I think
he's actually a primary school teacher in Holland.
Okay, yeah.
But there's been several other groups as well.
Yeah.
That's just. But there have been novel discoveries made by such things.
Yes.
And that's, of course, an entirely different approach to the big science, one could say.
Yep.
Where you've got researchers leading something, but the public actually doing the legwork.
Yeah. In citizen science is really valuable and important in the actual science itself, in astronomy and space sciences, but also in life sciences, a very important conservation science. Conservation biology is aided immensely by all the people out there counting birds, watching birds, counting organisms that they love. And it's oftentimes it's approached as a way to engage the public to understand science, but actually the public can play a role in the process of scientific discovery itself. I'm glad you mentioned that, John.
But of course, it's what you actually, that's where science came from, wasn't it? A lot of these people you've mentioned, a few were funded by government, like Galileo, or by the church or whatever. But of course, a lot were funded by their business enterprises. A lot of the historic astronomers, brewers seem to be the thing. Brewing and astronomy seem to be a very big connection. I don't know quite why, but make your millions in brewing and build yourself big telescopes.
Yeah.
And of course, Herschel, if you look at it, was self-funded for a lot of his life.
Absolutely. A book. Sorry, John, go ahead.
Only later on, of course, did the king come and put his money in.
Yep.
And I think he got quite I think his, when he moved to Slough, his only sort of thing was he had to allow the king and his friends to visit when they wanted to.
Well, it was very close to Windsor, so I imagine that happened. But,
yes.
No, I mean, John, I thought that's real great sideways thought. I hadn't made the connection with citizen science, and yet I can assure you with the Galaxy Zoo, it could not be done with public money.
Well,
it costs so much to do it, or indeed the bird counts cannot be done with public money. So it is truly citizens being philanthropic, because these things really do teach us a lot. I mean, the bird counts here have been very important.
they're donating that vital thing, time.
Yeah,
We've
it's
already
time.
got so much of that, haven't we?
Yeah. No, I think really, I thought that was a very interesting take that you've brought in. Is there anyone else who would like to comment? Actually, I think I could allow you to speak up if you unmute yourself or raise your hand, whichever. Rod,
Rod.
you want to unmute?
Yes, I'm trying. Just to say that a lot of people during the pandemic that have offered their bodies for vaccination testing as well. Kind of citizen science.
Yes.
Oh, that's also very clear, isn't it? In fact, the lady I'm married to was volunteering to be involved in COVID response and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Something to my shame that I did not get involved with, but there you are. Yes, that's a very good point.
Can I raise my hand?
Bill?
So Michael, I was curious on your slide about the laying the foundation for the great exhibition, glancing down the places on that slide. Yeah, Merthyr Tydfil kind of caught my eye. That's a nice little town in the valleys of South Wales, and I wouldn't have expected to see it on a list.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I guess back in those days, there was kind of wealth had been created in towns like that, partly because of the mining industry. So how much is
the steelworks or the
the
iron
steelworks as well? Yeah, that's right.
It was.
Yeah. So how much of philanthropy is?
I looked for other towns of the same size, and Merthyr Tydfil really stood out.
Yeah. So
remarkable, but they did have a lot of money going in.
They did.
Also with the ironworks, which of course now is long gone. Both.
So I guess it's inherent wealth in the economy allowed that in that instance. So do you see across different countries that linkage between philanthropy and some measure, GDP, gross national product, whatever? Are there correlations there?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think obviously you need, in order to give your wealth, your money away, you need to have enough security in your own life and for your own family to be able to do so. But I think that it is such a profoundly human act that there are people who are, and I don't know these numbers, off the top of my head, but if you look at the percentage, the per capita giving as a percentage of household giving, the most generous people in the United States are people at the lowest income as a percentage of their wealth. Now, what stands out are those people who have such wealth that they give $100 million away, and it's, their name is celebrated all over. But if you think of that as a proportion of their wealth, I actually think it's much more of a grassroots activity than we sometimes appreciate. And that what I love about the experience with the exhibition and all of those towns across the country, that there was so much public ownership of this, and people could give small amounts and made such a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And that's something to be really celebrated. And I worry sometimes that we over celebrate the vast sums given by individuals, and we under celebrate the vast amount that many individuals give. Because it can be sometimes hidden. It's a lot more stable if there are many people supporting something. So I'll go back to the National Trust, for example. If the National Trust had 100 members who funded everything that they did, they would not be as robust and stable as an organization as they are with hundreds of thousands of members supporting them.
So I guess it goes back to your point about motivation.
Yeah.
So if people, the correlation might be something around the, let's say the happiness index. If people are aware, educated, and essentially happy, then their motivation is higher in that respect.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else want to? I think some of the questions have been very enlightening for me. So is there anyone else who wants to? John, do you want to come back?
There is a question in the chat, actually, David. I hadn't spotted that. So
Rod Rees-Jones,
above that,
yeah, from Kelly Stella.
yeah.
So Kelly, would you like to, could you unmute and,
Well, we can ask the question.
yeah.
Yeah, it was
Certainly.
about the pattern of well, philanthropy to British universities, which is actually quite well developed for Oxford and Cambridge, but it tends to be focused on the colleges rather than on the universities at large. And non-Oxbridge universities do not seem to have such an established tradition. And so I was just asking whether there's any comments on how that could be developed outside the traditional context of Oxbridge.
It's an excellent question, and it's true. I think it's one of the great strengths of Oxbridge is the college system.
Fellowships and so forth for postdoctoral fellowships and so forth.
Yes,
very well developed in the colleges.
And it's a powerful part of its educational mission and tradition, the college structure, and the association as alums, as graduates of Oxford and Cambridge is so powerfully connected, I think, to their association with the colleges itself. And so there's a closer affinity and association, which is different than it is at Imperial, because we don't have the college structure. I think Oxford and Cambridge are, they are world leading universities as Imperial is. They've also have the benefit of having traditions around philanthropy that have been longer established than they have been at a non-Oxbridge university. So there's a bit of, they've been engaged in this process for a longer period, but there's the association is such a powerful part of philanthropy. Not only who's the best in the world that can help, I have a real fascination with human health in this certain area, who's the best at doing that work and how can I understand that, how can I support understanding that better, but who do I have an association with, who I trust and know, and that power of that association through the college is a really powerful part of the ingredient at Oxford and Cambridge and at many American universities as well. And that's a cultural difference, I'd say. My father, for example, is a graduate of the University of Michigan, which is a wonderful, great university, but sometimes I joke with him that it's almost like he was inducted in a cult. The association is so deep with Michigan. So there's that association is much more personal and profound sometimes than you'd see with American universities.
Yes, I worked with alumni, not recently, 30 years ago, with Imperial alumni in various places around the world. And what struck me was that the faculty system, that is the colleges of the Imperial, were the things that most people felt loyalty to.
Yes.
You were from RCS or you were in guilds or whatever. I sort of wonder, it seems to me that is something, it's to do with identity.
Absolutely. And
I mean, I sort of identify with Imperial, but I really think an awful lot of people identify with the college system. So the
Royal School of Mines, Royal College of Science,
Science, whatever.
A very important part of recognizing that is that is Imperial. They are part of Imperial, and that's part of the association.
Yeah. I think that's even stronger with the medical schools.
Very much so.
I mean, it's something to do with playing rugby, as far as I could tell, but never really got to the bottom of it. But anyhow, I think there's one more thing in the chat which pointed out that the Welsh industry funded the Scots Antarctic expedition as well as the Great Exhibition. Well, coming from Plymouth, where Scott, of course, came from, I'm all in favor of that, I know. Indeed, I think the point was 100 years ago, or even more, 150 years ago, South Wales didn't have any gold mines, but it had plenty of other things that made it very wealthy at the time. But okay, think probably if there's no more interventions.
David, there was a, if I may, there was a comment there about the lines between philanthropy and investment. And
Oh, yes. Pick that up. Yes.
May just make a comment on something that's now, we call it venture philanthropy is the term now. There is people are mobilizing their money in ways that is a blend of investment and philanthropy, which is more and more, that's becoming much more common. People are really interested in supporting, I'd say, doing research in a certain area of cancer diagnostics, which has some really fundamental challenges to support the brilliant people doing that. But then what that translates into as in terms of future medical technologies, they'll also invest in that to ramp up the solution to be brought out to people. And you see that in energy and health and lots of other areas as well. So it's an increasing kind of blend line. And there was, I think, a time when there was more industrial basic research, and right now that's not going on as much as it did in the times of Bell Labs and you know, in their heyday. So I think I'm just glad someone mentioned the kind of line that there is a blurring between philanthropy and investment of mobilizing private support for the enterprise.
I think that's a very strong point. I mean, in fact, you can even see it as part of an investment portfolio. If the key thing about philanthropy is that you can take bigger risks, if you have a fraction of your investment portfolio that is high risk, it may pay off, in which case you're very happy. But if it doesn't, if it's driving forward knowledge anyhow and turning scientists loose on the problems that nature gives us, I think that's blurring this line between philanthropy and investment. So absolutely clear. Okay.
Can I, David, just one last thing. I promised that I wouldn't make a pitch, but I thought I'd just share with everyone the priorities of the college, if I may, and philanthropy is important to what we're doing now. So just to share that we're really focused on the School of Public Health. We've broken ground on the new building in White City, and it's been so important, the financial support for the School of Public Health. And you've seen it in the work of Neil Ferguson and the major role the college has played in the COVID response through the Jameel Institute. We are launching a new Institute of Infection that brings together all of Imperial's infection research capabilities, which would be the largest in the world and the deepest in many ways in how we understand, find, treat, and prevent infection around the world. A major push for individuals, for scholarships, for minority, underrepresented international students, and talented researchers, postdoc fellowships and fellowships as well. The business school has a real focus around innovation and enterprise, financial services, fintech, financial innovation, and health and sustainability in business, and new areas in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the future of materials, and a kind of future model of university research and application at White City. So those are some of the things that we're focusing on for the college today.
Michael, I think that was well said. I hope everybody taken great note. I think, frankly, the work you're doing for the college is very important, and I can only encourage you to continue with the philosophical approach that you've outlined to us today. I thought that was very good. It's really, philanthropy has its role to play in supporting science and technology. I think you've made it beautifully clear, and I think we're all very grateful. I think I will close by pointing out that indeed, Friends of Imperial is also a charity devoted to expanding the capability of Imperial College to communicate. We have what I think could be described as one philanthropist looking after us, as Ayub, who supports us at a very fundamental level. But many of you who have responded to the appeal for funds during the COVID crisis, I think should think of yourselves as philanthropists for science. And for we, as Friends of Imperial, are spreading the news of the great work being done by Imperial and you all contribute in your way. And please continue to do so. But I think that one of the points Michael made is please feel good about it. It's really, you know, it's maybe not a short-term benefit, but you should feel good. And I think that's what Friends of Imperial's about. And at a totally gigantic level, it's what Michael is doing for the college overall. So I think at that point, I will thank you again and thank everybody for coming. We have one last fireside chat before the beginning of the academic year, which is a week today, by Jonathan Eastwood, no relation to David Southwood, I have to say. And he's going to be talking about work on the way the sun and the earth interact, and what's called space weather, and the threat to life, to not intelligent life, but the capacity of us to live in the advanced technological environment we live in, whilst our friend the sun, which is very good for us, can very much disrupt systems in extreme manners. So Jonathan will be talking about that. He'll be talking about a lot of the people at Imperial working in this area and allied areas. And that's a week today at 4 o'clock. And I look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you again. Thank you very much, and see you next week.